Hello and welcome to our final podcast of our PR and Communications Reflective account. I'm Eddie Koppoe, and let's get straight into it. So I want to take an opportunity to kind of look at some points that now we're coming towards the end of the year that we can kind of look back and reflect on. About myself as a sport marketer, I think it's something we looked at in the beginning of the course, and actually there's something else we're discussing and going into this in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But kind of for me, there's a lot more things out there that I've experienced through this course and the 2 semesters that I've been here, in terms of what I find interesting and maybe perhaps routes after graduating. But like I said, we'll discuss a little bit more in the next slide. My experiences and sort of my goals for coming away next year. So for me, I'm going into my last year and I'm going to be doing my dissertation or my thesis project. Originally, I had the plan of coming to Brock and looking at recruitment and retention levels in match officials. So I was supposed to interview some hockey coaches, officials, match officials, hockey match officials, football, and soccer and basketball. But again, just the way the things came through, I didn't end up doing that research here. But through the year, I've kind of taken a little bit more of a interest in terms of athletes and social media and their interactions with fans. So looking perhaps to change my thesis project and maybe do a little bit more reading over that during the summer, and hopefully go in back home and get that new research question underway. And so in terms of strategies this year, so a lot of classes, you're expected to sort of take notes and kind of regurgitate information in the form of kind of obviously your exams. And some classes, they are needed to be done, 2 + 2 has to equal 4, and those sort of things. But sort of we've been encouraged to kind of take theories and examples in class and try to apply them in past experiences, and I've done that with sports and athletes that I'm intimate with, and for me that kind of it kind of helps my learning a lot more. And my notes that I take in class are of course less of what the professors telling us, and they're actually more questions that I kind of pose myself throughout the lectures and throughout the discussions that we have. And finally, in terms of further development for myself, one of the big things in this course I'd love to expand or have a look at sort of the relationship of PR management and athletes, and how that relationship works in sort of the professional element. And things to as small as like how does an athlete manage their Twitter account? Do they do it themselves? How do they get verified? Do they have a team working behind them? How much input do they get? And I spoke to a professor before, from people who are athletes who are essentially banned from posting things themselves because they're not trusted. And of course their actions affect more than just themselves. It's their brand, it's their team, could even be their city that they play in, and how much involvement the athlete gets with that, and of course working intimately with athletes. Of course, if you're a fan of the sport, you're going to be a fan of them, and working with them may bring that new light. So I'd love to investigate in sort of that relationship and how those things work. So firstly, I am going to duplicate this slide both with the 2P91 reflective account and the 3P251. So if you've watched one already, you just skip ahead in the video, because I'm going to copy them. They're going to be exactly the same, because I think they're both they're both applicable to what I'm going to say in terms of that. So I had the amazing opportunity to meet with Daryl Seidman, who is the head of consumer products in NFL Canada. Professor Chris Chard was very gracious enough to put me in contact with him as an ex-student, and I went to his the NFL Canada office in Toronto, and I just had a meeting with him there, and were able to he was able to get to know me, and I kind of discussed things and kind of let him know what I was interested in, and kind of asked more about what he did and in terms of his job, and how we got from being a graduate from Brock to being the head of NFL consumer products in Canada, and his journey on that, and what he looks for, or what an employer would look for. So I got some real great insight with NFL Canada, and of course, if you've been intimate with these podcasts, you'll know my passion for American football. I could talk a lot about what we talked about. It's great insights, but things I can kind of relate back to the course and to my studies here. One of the things that we discussed was how the NFL were almost grooming certain markets ready for potential investors, or for an owner to essentially move if they want to. And one of the top prime market is the UK. So NFL have been doing a lot of work, and essentially, if an owner wanted to explore options of moving their franchise to another country, the UK would be the most primed market. And we discussed a little bit last episode in terms of the NFL, but they do have strong PR links in both Europe and in the UK, and they've been doing a lot of work there. I think we're going to talk a little bit later, or I may have talked already before, kind of how they're already running football training camps in the UK, and that's already kind of building that culture there, and like I said, priming that market for an owner to move into that team, move into that country. They already have like a great media platform, so the NFL has been shown on the TV a great deal. They got a really good viewership in terms of the Super Bowl and week to week viewership, and then we discussed sort of how to keep fans interested during the off season, because one of the things he asked was kind of how things are in the UK when the season's off. And being in North America, maybe for my first time obviously during an NFL off season, I've been very intimate towards how, especially with the NFL, that the season really never stops, and the show keeps going on in between free agency and the draft. Now, it happens a lot more in North America. In the UK, everything seems to stop, and I think NFL are gonna they would be looking at ways of creating essentially that carry on from the end of the season to the beginning of the season, and keeping fans interested. Even my local football, like American football team in the UK, they plan their first sort of taster sessions the weekend after the Super Bowl, so they can kind of take advantage of that spike in sort of in interest. So it'd be interesting to see the moves that sort of NFL will make to kind of make NFL sort of that 365-day engagement, and things they can do for that. And of course, lastly, I got a free hat, so I was very, very, very lucky. I cherished that hat, and yes, it was a great experience, and I really appreciate the time. So just wanted to kind of build on the discussion with moral decoupling that we've talked about in the sort of last previous episodes, and tie that in with the integrity of the sport versus the integrity as a human being. And through that, I wanted to explore or discuss kind of the three ways that athletes or professionals for athletes can do to kind of get back on track after a scandal or some sort of issues. First example is to elevate performance. Well, we've seen this with Kobe Bryant. So he continued to come after his scandals, come and perform at a high level. Now his legacy is he's a Hall of Fame basketball player, one of the greatest of all time, and nobody mentions the issues he had before. And later we'll discuss a little bit more about athlete branding and sort of the legacy in that. But now Kobe has turned from being from his scandal to now being sort of what I call like a low risk endorsement that we even discussed in class, that to partner with Kobe Bryant is seen to be a good thing. It shouldn't be any issues, and he used his performance on the court to kind of change the narrative of what consumers think about him, of course, and what we as society think about him, or as definitely as a sporting society. Probably outside of sport, we probably will find people remember the scandal more than his on the court performance. Second, we've seen own up. So when Maria Sharapova had the sort of the doping or the drug issues, the CNN reports that Maria Sharapova maintained her public favorability by owning up to a mistake and apologizing for it herself. As a result, she is liked more than by 84% of US consumers following the scandal, compared to the 88 previous. In terms of her, the any PR is good PR kind of turned up, and she almost got in front of that. But it's interesting in terms of when we discussed last year marketing about people. Consumers generally care more about the integrity of the sport and less of things that we might consider human things, moral things in terms of like cheating and domestic violence. But with sort of the response that she got, could we question sort of, are certain sports more tolerable? Is tennis, the culture around it, are you more able to have an issue and come out and say, apologize for it and own up to it and kind of be able to come back from it? Would that happen in another sport, such as maybe football or rugby or hockey? Could there be questions about different cultures around sport and whether they'd be able to accept that? I think so. I think there's some other sports that if that happened, it wouldn't. There'd be a bit more backlash for the athlete. And finally, give something back. So we've seen this with Ray Lewis, who we've mentioned before. He had some issues involving the murders of two gentlemen, and he opened up the Ray Lewis Family Foundation to provide personal and economic assistance for disadvantaged youth. And he's pledged a load of money in other ventures, and this is to help win back the support of people, his fans and people around the league. So those are sort of good three examples we've seen in professional sport of athletes coming back from scandals and how they've managed to turn things around. So the example was given in class about how sport teams are providing social media posts in multiple languages to kind of reach more fans, of course, in different countries who speak different languages. So I kind of wanted to explore what's being done to increase global exposure for a brand from a sort of a sports marketing perspective. So one of the things I kind of came across with the things mostly in soccer, but it's kind of these multi-sports organizations such as the City Group. As a fan or a consumer, you may be doing this subconsciously or unconsciously, but you may link to a team if you're going to another city that are part of a sports organization that you are already part of. So if you Manchester City, if you follow them, and you go to Australia, you may have an allegiance with Melbourne because they're part of the same group. And Fenway Sport are also doing that and taking a step further. They're doing this across multi-sport. So if I was to support Liverpool and I was to look to get into baseball, perhaps one of the factors of me having allegiance with a team, things like location, and apart from that, it might be that like the Red Sox are already part of this sports group that I'm already familiar with, and I think that's a good way of how sports teams and kind of companies can grow their sort of global market and increase exposure in terms of that. Now, what's interesting is soccer, football is kind of global and is one of the sort of the only sport leagues that have competitive teams from different countries. What I mean in terms of that is a team from a domestic team from England will compete against a domestic team from Spain, Italy, all across the world. If you take that example with something like so with basketball, professional basketball, it wouldn't be the same. So like the Golden State Warriors wouldn't be competitive with a professional basketball team in Lithuania. They would get beaten quite well. You may see this a little bit in rugby league and rugby union. You can see teams from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Domestic teams are very competitive against teams from Scotland, France, Ireland, Wales. But things like in American sports, North American sports, we don't see it as much. So with that narrative set up, kind of another way that sort of the global sports marketing is kind of being able to benefit from international stars. Now that's the reason I made the point before, because in the UK, from a soccer point of view, it's not a big thing to see players from other countries or have English players playing in other countries and other teams. You can see with the examples from Joel Embiid and Giannis Antetokounmpo and Dirk Nowitzki that fans from Germany will be attracted to basketball because of Dirk. He's for a while he was the biggest star in the league, and he was German. And we're going to see the same with Giannis. They're talking about him being the MVP, and you may see more of a Greek and maybe Nigerian fans come to the game because of him and because of his international status. And same with Embiid, being a Cameroonian. We may see them more in that side. And then again, in terms of sort of global exposure with the NHL, they've been doing training camps in countries of the nationality of the players. I think this one was done in Switzerland. One of the examples was, and again, that's how you can take advantage of sort of international stars. And like I said, it's not something that you can do in soccer because domestic teams are very fluid in terms of nationalities, but definitely you can see the examples here with the NHL and NBA. They're able to take advantage of their international stars because the leagues aren't as diverse. So with some of the news that has come out recently, I wanted to have a look at how athletes' branding and legacy can be affected and how we perceive them, and ultimately their ability to kind of sell themselves as a product. So one of the ways that they can do this is kind of improve perception after retirement. So Tony Romo is a really unique example of this. So he used to be a quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys, who was a respected quarterback, did get a fair bit of criticism for his career. People were saying he was on the verge of being a Hall of Fame or not. So he was good, not the greatest, but very good. Now he's retired and he has almost boosted himself because of his incredible and very entertaining sportscasting career. And he's almost, you can appreciate his intelligence of the game as a quarterback more from the booth than on the field, because he's calling out plays before they happen. He's very suave, he's very entertaining. So now the perception of him has changed. We now almost see him as a better quarterback now that he's come off the field and he's gone into the sports booth. We've seen the other way happen with athletes, and we don't even remember them as athletes. Now, think people like Dwayne Johnson, The Rock Johnson, or Terry Crews. They've gone so far from that they don't even have a sport legacy. Now, what's interesting as well, it's much harder to find examples of athletes that were liked or tolerated during their career, and then that were hated when they retired. And with those, you would think that sponsors would stay far away from those, but from what I see, it doesn't really happen too often. What we have though is sort of a tarnished reputation. So although he's not officially retired, Mike McCarthy, who was just fired as the head coach of the Green Bay Packers, a lot of stories have come out about him being a not a very good coach. He was getting massages while he sent his subordinates to do meetings. Apparently he was very insecure about his knowledge, and he liked to take a lot of the glory when it wasn't him. So now that he was retired, or now how he's come out of a job, stories have come out about him because he's not there anymore, and there's been investigations, and it'll be very interesting to see how he gets back in. He says he wants to coach again, but ultimately now his legacy has been tarnished as a head coach because of these stories. The next thing I kind of wanted to look at is a pre-retirement preparation. So many athletes have kind of made moves during their career to help their brand and help that transition from playing into retirement. So we've seen this with David Beckham, LeBron James, even Frank Lampard. With the football, with Frank Lampard and David Beckham, we've seen them move to America to maybe help with their brand, but more David Beckham, because we hear a lot about David Beckham, not so much Frank Lampard. And also what's interesting is that their skill ability looks similar, because of course football, soccer in Europe, where obviously Beckham and Lampard made their careers, the transition from that to MLS is going to make them look better or the same, even though their skill set might have gone down. Now with KD, Kevin Durant, there's an interesting case, because now the talk about him, he's a free agent. There's talk about him going to New York, so either the Knicks or Brooklyn Nets, more the Knicks. Of course, right now they're actually they're bottom ranked in the NBA. Interesting that the talk of him going to the Knicks is not for basketball, but for his media company. So, is he already planning for his legacy after retirement? Which is fair enough. As a standard professional career, you might last 10 years, which of course is, it could be 1/7 of your life. So, that preparation is understandable, but you can sort of see how athletes may make decisions depending on sort of who they are and what they have planned for after the game. Then there's the kind of always loved and respected. So the example here of Muhammad Ali, they're kind of like the gold dust for sponsors, because everybody loves them, they're respected. And what's interesting is when I kind of looked around sort of the most loved and most respected athletes of kind of all time, a lot of them were before the social media time. So whether that's because we get to see more of them, so we get to see more of their personality, or more of their lifestyle, or maybe because the things they do don't get broadcasted or passed around so easily. Maybe it's a benefit for for athletes 20 years ago, and it's easier for them to be more loved because we don't see so much bad things about them. And like I said, with that, they always loved and respected is interesting with the Kobe example, because he kind of, like I said earlier, he moved from the scandal, and now we see him as the always loved and respected, when if things didn't go well, he could have been one of the ones that had a tarnished reputation. So we were talking about sort of the 7 warning signs of a looming crisis, and I really wanted to see and explore how that looked like in something current and something that I follow. As of course we move through this in the next sort of few moments, we'll be able to see that a lot of it did have or did follow sort of this pattern that we looked at in class. So firstly, kind of that surprise. So with the AFF, if you haven't already seen, we'll discuss it a little bit more, but essentially it's a professional football league that was playing, and now the league has stopped suddenly. So like I said, we'll go things about that. So that surprise. So both players and league officials were sort of taken by surprise as things were going on. So players were actually kicked out of hotels. They got back from a game and all their stuff was in the lobby, and they were stiffed with a $2,500 bill. And while others were trying to return home, others were returning to practice, and they were told to go home from their facilities, and people weren't really sure what was going on at the time. And that kind of led to insufficient information. So weeks leading up, there was some sort of rumors circling around that the league might fold, but the league never really said anything about it. There was like a little bit of a thing, and they said that everything was fine. They had some issues with some money at the beginning, but they found another investor. So again, those things were a bit murky at the time, so I could see that happening. And then in terms of events, so like I said, the report said that the league didn't have enough money to pay players. Also, there was a defragmented relationship between the AAF and the NFL Players Association. And that was kind of the beginning to the end as we move through this. And a loss of control, and there was actually a physical loss of control in terms of the new majority owner, Tom Dunnan, had ceased operations. And that started the downward spiral, and then, as we said, moved into this scrutiny. So many fans and players, and even the other 2 owners who didn't know what was going on, took to social media for answers and to share experiences. So we had players and other league members talking about certain things that happened to them, and there was a lot of speculation going on online through the media. Then the siege mentality came in. There's a lot of attacks for Tom Dunnan. Even the other owners were, like I said, putting things online, and they didn't know why the league had ceased. And Tom Dunnan, rightly so in my opinion, was painted as the villain to this. And for him, he probably wouldn't have foreseen this happening, for all these things to turn on him. And then the panic ensues. Players are left not knowing where they stand, and there were some issues if they weren't allowed to sign with an NFL team. And that's kind of, this whole thing has been a real mess for them. And there's talks about them starting up a league in 2020, and be very difficult, especially with the XFL that we started in 2020, to really come back from this. But it'll be interesting to see. But like I said, we'll just want to explore having sort of the signs and how that looks like in a real-time example of something that I follow. So lastly, I just wanted to reflect on things that we kind of mentioned before, and to kind of build on them in terms of sort of sport and ethnicity, and how that looks, and in terms of modern social media and how that's maybe helping, or is it making harder for sort of teams and organizations to be accountable. So we had the issue with Russell Westbrook in Utah. So the way social media for me, as looking from a sport manager's perspective, the way it makes things a little bit difficult for me is because now these incidents are filmed, and in an instant they're uploaded, and in an instant they're being seen by thousands of people before an organization has a chance to even see it, respond, and get ahead of it. In the paper that we wrote as a group, we discussed, of course, if you read it already, the Ottawa Senators, and one of the things that we looked at and suggested was there's certain research and theories that would work towards a team really trying to get ahead of these issues, especially on social media. But it's almost impossible for an organization like that to get ahead, because these things are shared and broadcasted in an instant. So now all eyes are sort of on Utah and how they respond to these things, and there's a small margin sort of for that. See, now from that, all other reports about race issues have come up in terms of now through social media, other players have spoke out now saying that they've received similar racial treatment from Utah Jazz fans or even Utah fans, and there's almost a now a thread of kind of do Utah have a problem with race, or do they have a problem with racism in their sport and within their fans? So it can make it very hard for sport practitioners and for organizations to stay ahead of those things on social media. And with that, we are finished for the year. So if you've got to this point, thank you very, very much for sticking with it, and wish you all the best in the future. And once again, thank you very much for tuning in, and wish you all the best. Bye-bye.